I always love it when Gen Z is romanticizing being a millennial in the early 2010s because let me tell you, I would walk from my apartment to my open space office full of other millennials with the exposed brick walls and the industrial lighting, and on the way, I would pass by guys in skinny jeans with little mustaches, riding fixie bikes and playing Sleepyhead by Passion Pit. But yeah, there was something in the air. Like, we couldn't identify it at the time, but there was just such an ambient level of optimism about the future that we do not have anymore.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our June video essay here on the financial diet. And as indicated by my always relevant, timely, well-shot, thoughtful TikTok, we are here to talk about millennials, and specifically this ever-present question that seems to be more and more on the minds of young people as we enter some of the most turbulent and chaotic economic times in recent memory, and that is, did millennials really live in paradise? Now, there's a current wave of Gen Z nostalgia for all things millennial culture and aesthetics, as recently discussed in places like my beloved Tiffany Ferguson's video on the subject, which in a sort of Inception-like layer also references my video on the subject. I was also recently interviewed by Newsweek for that TikTok that I played at the beginning because it sort of achieved escape velocity and started a huge conversation. But whether it was our music, and I will honestly stand by the fact that I think indie sleaze was one of the best possible genres for college students and young 20-somethings to be jamming out to. Let the record show that 23-year-old Chelsea was indeed at a music festival with Diplo / Major Lazer, MGMT, Azalea Banks. I also saw Iggy Azalea and Krishan play at a store opening. It was a crazy time, but suffice to say, I saw Passion Pit, I saw Santigold. Santigold? I don't know, you just can't tell me that young people music is hitting the same now. What do you guys have? Benson Boone? I'm sure some of our indie sleaze icons were Mormon too. Anyway, whether it is nostalgia for our music, our clothing, the general sense of optimism, our media, or the economy that we were living in, there is undoubtedly a question being posed right now, which is, why were millennials so happy and optimistic compared to their Gen Z counterparts? Because there does sometimes seem to be a perception that things were better for millennials, regardless of their economic situation. And I would also like to say that in the comments of that TikTok, many people were throwing Nepo baby accusations my way, insisting that no one could have been living the Brooklyn-dwelling, listicle writing lifestyle in 2013 to 2015 if they weren't being subsidized by their parents. To which I say, I have never been subsidized by my parents, and more importantly, I was being paid $36,000 a year to write those listicles. So when I tell you I was making 50 cents stretch into $1, I certainly was. One of many reasons that I was in so much credit card debt. Even though my economic situation objectively wasn't great at the time, I can't deny that there was a sort of optimism in the air. And a lot of this was as much professional as it was personal. To quote myself from that Newsweek article, and yes, they truncated my quote, "We were part of a generation that was delusionally optimistic about our professional potential," Fagan said. "We were really excited about being a young working person, going to the office and going for that promotion. There was just a level of excitement in our generation, and we weren't living on social media as much at the time. I think people were more present, living the life that young people today don't get to enjoy as much. There's more anxiety and self-awareness because everything is so performative now." Now, you might be asking yourself, that sounds so short and unnuanced for a Chelsea commentary on the subject. Trust me that was cut down from like 5 minutes. But the point is, when we look at things like economic or even mental health indicators, clearly things have gotten worse in some ways for young people. And as one person put it in the comment section of my original TikTok, it felt at the time like technology was a way to bring us closer rather than what it feels like now, which is pretty unequivocally tearing us apart. And while it's pretty undeniable that there were several vibe shifts around 2016, it doesn't mean that what came before was all that good to begin with, or even that much easier than how things have been the past 10 years. Side note, it is so crazy to me that it's about to be 10 years since 2016. And it's also worth noting that this retroactive perception of happiness on the part of young millennials was also probably more a reflection of our media culture than our actual culture, something we'll get to soon. But as we all know watching this financial channel, if there is one thing that defined millennial coming of age, it was the Great Recession. So why were so many millennials optimistic despite coming of age in one of the worst economic crises of the modern era? Well, to really unpack this and to answer whether or not we did live in paradise, we need to start with chapter 1, the unmatched political vibes of 2008. I also want to start this chapter up front by saying that our video essays keep getting flagged and having monetization issues for saying the names of certain political figures. So we're gonna talk about them without actually saying the names so that we don't continue harming the channel in service. And honestly, for at least the current political figurehead, it's giving Voldemort at a certain point. I don't wanna keep saying the name because I feel like he takes up so much real estate in my brain anyway, and we mention him on, every other show that we have. But anyway, we're gonna talk about the 2008 political vibes, and we all know who we're talking about here. Thank you for bearing with me in these troubling times. Also, change your policies, YouTube. They're accusing us of election propaganda. Okay. So as someone who was freshly out of high school in 2008 when a certain figure became president, and if I go back and look at my personal Facebook from that time, I had like multiple 20, 30 plus photo albums of going to rallies, being in DC the night of the election. Like it was... And again, maybe partially because I was 19 years old, but I can just tell you the vibes were truly unmatched. Like, I think, was it probably a bad thing that we were like huffing paint in terms of like a completely vibes-based political ethos where we were treating rallies like concerts and just getting so excited? Because maybe I'm really exposing myself here. Maybe the other 19-year-olds who turned out in record numbers to vote that year were doing so for like really disciplined political, economic, or foreign policy reasons. I can tell you for sure that I was doing it for vibes reasons. But yeah, so it was probably not a great thing. And we saw over the subsequent 8 years the limitations of a sort of political apparatus that is supported as much by popular appeal and media sentiment as it is by actual sort of delivered results for the working and middle class. We can unpack that at a later date, but suffice it to say, the vibes were incredible. And I also think that's something that Gen Z obviously would not have a full grasp on because you guys weren't really like lucid at that time, and you were children really. But the vibes prior to 2008, like leading up to 2008, like there was an ambient level of conservatism in American culture that I think we would find utterly shocking today on television, in our political discourse, in our social norms, in our fashions, in our media. Everything was quite conservative. It was quite nationalistic. I think people really forget how much of a bipartisan mandate there was for our foreign policy at the time, how much if you did not fit a certain number of very conservative worldviews and aesthetics and sort of habits, that you were not American or you were a bad American. We really were, for many years, a very sort of reactionary and traumatized country post 9/11. And I think as a result, the 2008 sort of response to that all the more so felt like we were truly at the dawning of a new era, which is, again, something that is to some extent vibes-based. There are obviously more tangible reasons why that may have been the case. It's obviously very historical to have had our first Black president. It was obviously a very tonal shift from a lot of what had come before it. But with a little distance, we can obviously see that a lot of the promises of the ultra-progressive wave that was coming in 2008 weren't necessarily delivered on. To learn more about the economics of that period, we again spoke to Sawler, who's currently a political science PhD candidate at the University of Rochester.
I mean, almost certainly we're looking back with rose-colored glasses. Like, nostalgia's, one heck of a drug. I think there are things about, like the era that are qualitatively different that people might, I think, like legitimately be nostalgic for. So the major data sources we use to track these kind of big social trends are like the General Social Survey and the American National Election Study. And by almost any metric you look at relative to, say 2004 through 2008 to today, trust in institutions, social trust, have all declined, and tensions between in and out groups have all increased. And I think that's relevant for this kind of like romanticization, because even though circumstances may, qualitatively, I think, reflect that period of time, I think there genuinely was sort of a greater degree of social trust and institutional trust and actual genuine optimism at that time that people may not have now. It makes sense to me that that's something that people would be nostalgic for, because we think about institutional trust as sort of the grease that keeps democracy functioning well, right? Like, so if you believe that courts and law enforcement will deal fairly with you, and that you can trust your doctors, and that you can trust, Congress or state government or the federal government, at least to some extent, then you're more likely to use those institutions rather than seeking like extra institutional recourse. And as that declines, I think there's greater uncertainty, there's greater, certainly, social mistrust. There's also, it starts to, I think, degrade the level of optimism and hope and sense of options that people feel that they have. So it makes sense to me. I think that people are romanticizing that, because even if we might look back at like some of the millennial fashion trends and cringe a little bit, socially at least, like dynamics were very different at the time.
And to talk about the media environment of this time and much more, we sat down with one of my favorite YouTubers and a dear friend, Princess Weeks.
It's hard now when we've really been dissecting his legacy, but living in it, it really did feel like things were going to change. Like it felt like the election of a Black president meant that we were going through a larger cultural shift, and we were, just like backwards, but we were having all the aesthetics of progress really at the forefront. We were seeing conversations about civil rights and diversity and women's rights being taken really seriously, and I think that's a really big shift. I mean, we're seeing at this era, even though it led to like pop culture feminism, a lot more of feminism not being a dirty word anymore. It was no longer just like a punchline of like a type of character that would show up. Like people like Beyonce were making music that really spoke to this idea that feminism could be sexy, could be inclusive. And, we were seeing the beginning of streaming services like Netflix, but also the kinds of stories that they were telling. Orange is the New Black was really transformative. And the idea that you could make a series like that, that you were going to watch it all in one chunk, and that it was this very intersectional, it had some issues, of course, like it used the white character Piper as framing, but all of these things at the time felt like a really a real shift forward in so many different ways. But really now looking back, we're like, oh, it's just the seeds of capitalism, like really teaching you to be joyful in it. You know what I mean? Like, of like, isn't it fun how we can monetize your civil rights and your social justice? And so I think you have a lot of people who learned that earnestness and then really had to deal with the fallout of it not really coming to pass.
But when you talk about the culture, if the culture prior to 2008 was extremely conservative, kind of on all fronts, the culture post-2008, and especially in 2012 onward, was very much the opposite. Some cultural critics have referred to it as kind of an end of history positioning, where you're sort of assuming that we are living in an inherently progressive, just time that is only going to get more so with the passage of time. And when you look at a lot of the media that was very successful during this era, 2008 onward, you can see this incredibly prevalent tone of optimism that really defined the culture.
Ready?
What is your daughter doing?
Kicking ass.
What makes America the greatest country in the world?
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And when I meet Thomas Jefferson, I'ma compel him to include women in the sequel. Right!
Government isn't just a boys' club anymore. Women are everywhere. Hillary Clinton, Sarah Palin, me, Nancy Pelosi. We did it!
2013 is really interesting because you had Beyonce's self-titled album came out, which was like the first time that she ever did the whole like digital drop thing of like just dropping an entire visual album. Orange is the New Black really just changing the idea of what streaming could do and making it look like you could really have these gritty series. And again, having be reelected for another 4 years in that time of like really solidifying that like America could, like, voting for him once was like, okay, him winning twice was like, oh, okay, like surely it must mean something. And then now it's like a Get Out skit. I would have voted for a third time if I could. So it's like, what did it really mean in the grand scheme of things if right after that was and I think getting elected revealed to people how many did not actually go on that journey with us. It really showed those divisions.
And even in our early internet culture, when we look at the kinds of voices and platforms that were really thriving in that era, a lot of it was similarly based around this kind of optimistic, inclusive, progressive worldview. You had things like early YouTube, Tumblr, yikes, even Zanga, double yikes. You had the ubiquity of things like BuzzFeed listicles and then the ensuing BuzzFeed videos. You had early Twitter, which was pretty undeniably dominated by a pretty left of center bent. And as I mentioned in the intro, even many of the very platforms we were using, like Instagram, which were in their earlier stages at this time, felt quite promising. They took up less real estate in our lives, they had less of an impact on our mental health, and generally speaking, we were looking at them as a revolutionary new way to not only maintain connections with people, but to make new ones. And at least on social issues, there was a bit of a speed run of a lot of progressive achievements. For example, there was the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the official federal policy established in 1994 that prohibited LGBTQ+ individuals from serving in the military, at least openly, and led to thousands being discharged. It was repealed in 2011, and service members who are previously discharged for being LGBTQ+ were allowed to re-enlist. And of course, we've already taken one big step backward here with the current trans military ban. In 2015, the Obergefell-SCOTUS decision effectively made same-sex marriage legal nationwide. The Family and Medical Leave Act was initially vetoed twice before being signed into law in 1993, allowing people to take up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave from work for qualifying reasons. And we are certainly nowhere near where we should be in terms of parental leave, but FMLA was the first step toward having any type of federally mandated work leave, and it meant more legal protections for women's jobs after they had a baby or needed time off of work for caregiving. And millennials grew up with this being the norm. You had things like the Affordable Care Act, which was deeply imperfect and not at all anything close to universal health care, but it was at least something. And even as we lived through an era of progressively worsening reproductive health care access on the state level, Roe v. Wade didn't seem like something that we would see disappear. Spoiler alert.
In the moment, it can seem like, oh, this is the cure for everything. Now that we've overcome, this one singular social hurdle, that's it, and life is excellent now. And that's almost never the case. Progress is always sort of like a slow trudge uphill, but I think we're certainly remiss to dismiss the idea that the huge gains in public policies and like civil rights for equal rights in the early 20-teens did not substantially impact the material well-being of huge swaths of people. I mean, just speaking about the Affordable Care Act, the percentage of uninsured people living in the United States was cut in half due to the passage of the ACA. Obviously, the ACA is imperfect and its enforcement is imperfect. And the digital marketplace can be a pain to navigate. But I mean, this was a hugely life-changing policy for a lot of people, and in ways that they don't often recognize. I do think there is a real sense in which things were good in the 20-teens in a way that is difficult to appreciate now for a lot of people. One thing that I see with students a lot, because I teach both returning to education students and incoming college students, so I get two big sort of diverse age groups. People in my returning to education classes are really horrified by political concessions speeches now, or the lack thereof. They're very hostile. They're not very, the sort of broad signaling about, the good of democracy and conceding. And my younger students sort of can't fathom the early 2000s, presidential concession speeches, how conciliatory, how polite, how congratulatory they were. It doesn't take that many years for huge shifts in perspective. So it makes sense to me that people who were not sort of politically aware, politically active during Obergefell, the ACA, really at any time of sort of major progress would think things are still really bad. It actually couldn't have been that good because it doesn't take long for what people are used to shift. But it can be true that things were not maybe as great as they felt at the time, and that these were hugely impactful pieces of public policy.
So it was in some ways easier to feel like the government was on our side meaning a more diverse and progressive group of young people than the electorate had essentially ever seen with the 2008 election, because huge sweeping legislation was being passed that felt progressive, even if their actual impacts fell very short of their promise.
No, I think it's interesting because it kind of bleeds into each other, because you have, the Gamergate, which is like the online harassment campaign and like the backlash to feminism and diversity in like 2014, 2015, which leads you right into and then Me Too. So I think as we're seeing these strides go forward and feminism becoming more mainstream, this pushback happens almost instantaneously. But it's treated as a niche online thing and not something that will transform itself into like a political vehicle. And I think with Me Too, especially in the incarnation that we think of with Harvey Weinstein and then Bill Cosby, a lot of that was rooted in decades of not just trauma for victims, but like people really working to take down these really powerful figures. And I feel like that work was being done to do that. But again, within like a year of that happening, especially when the Aziz Ansari situation became one of the talking points, you saw instantly being like, has Me Too gone too far? Like they were saying that before Weinstein was even in court. Like there was just this really intensity of like, well, what is this going to mean for like dating and interactions? Like as soon as that was taking place, people were finding ways to dismiss it and picking certain figures to tear apart in this, as you will see eventually with Amber Heard, who, even though her situation with Johnny Depp technically started before that incarnation of the Me Too movement started, her case with Johnny Depp became like a way of symptomatically ending Me Too. And that can only happen if there was a desire to end Me Too in the eyes of certain people who always saw it as only supposed to exist in one sphere, to only get like a few bad guys and not really lead to like systemic change.
And of course, progressive policies like Medicaid have been often criticized for how difficult they can be to actually gain coverage, but Republican legislatures are arguably more responsible for the red tape that makes them a costly burden. They want to make sure those policies are as difficult as possible to actually implement. Now, for many of us who lived through these various eras, the pre-2008, post-2008, and then 2016, there was a kind of collective feeling of delusion going into the 2016 election, a sort of mirage that had been broken. Lest we forget, it was the received wisdom of pretty much the entire media class that what happened in 2016 could not have happened.
I definitely think that we did not fully understand how porous those things were. I remember very clearly when 2016 happened, when 45 won, people saying like, don't worry about Roe, like that's the law of the land, it's not going to go away. And people were so sure about that, and then it was gone. And I think that was just really humbling and numbing and terrifying. And I think as someone with severe anxiety, I always think things can go away, but I think that's why now, with the state of the courts how it is, people are extra nervous, because if something can be once considered the law of the land and then taken away, clearly there are no laws of the land. Clearly all of this is porous if someone with enough power seeks to undermine it. And so I do think that through 45 on, we do see the rest of that 2010s era sort of like chickens coming home to roost. All the things that we thought had already been swept under the surface, and you realize how much resentment there was.
And while we do take some of these policies like FMLA for granted, we're already seeing states move backwards on restrictions that have long felt like common sense, such as child labor laws. So while things have objectively been much worse in American history, when you see the already limited progressive achievements of the 2008 to 2016 era being rolled back as quickly as possible, the idea of millennials living in a kind of progressive paradise really isn't that difficult to fathom. But at the same time, millennials saw some of the worst economic developments since the literal Great Depression, which brings us to our next chapter. Chapter 2, the Post-Recession Era. So despite the widely held stereotype now that millennials were living in this sort of earnest utopia, the reality for most millennials was that as young people, they were inheriting one of the worst economies of the modern era. Because if there's one defining aspect of basically every millennial's young adult experience, it's how they were impacted by the Great Recession. So let's start by addressing what the Great Recession actually was, because for all of our current talk of recession this, are we in one, is one coming, etc., it's easy to forget that it was called the Great Recession for a reason. Quote, the Great Recession lasted from roughly 2007 to 2009 in the US, although the contagion spread around the world, affecting some economies longer. The root cause was excessive mortgage lending to borrowers who normally would not qualify for a home loan, which greatly increased risk to the lender. Lenders were willing to take this risk as they could simply package the loans into an instrument they sold, passing on the risk to investors. And the Great Recession had an impact on the careers of recent graduates that was larger than what would have been expected given the trends observed in earlier periods, even after taking into account the greater severity of the Great Recession. Young people fared particularly poorly between mid-2007 and late 2009, and in studies that we conducted separately, we find consistent evidence that the impact of the Great Recession on new graduates was significantly larger in earnings and employment rates than previous recessions would have predicted. For example, the drop in the employment rate of those aged 22 in 2010 was at least twice as large as expected, according to the findings of a study that looked at people who were born between 1948 and 1997. The effect of entering the labor market during the Great Recession on earnings was also much greater than would have been expected. The negative impact of the unemployment rate on the earnings of those who graduated between 2004 to 2011 was between 2 and 3 times the size of earlier periods, according to a separate study. And this is not to say, by the way, that the Great Recession was not also hugely impacting older generations. It obviously was, and arguably in more acute ways than it was impacting young people just graduating college and entering the workforce. But it's important to remember that the impacts of that recession were much greater than even just your regular recession.
One way to think about this, although it's a little less intuitive, is thinking about wages in terms of constant dollars. And so constant dollars are just normalized to the wage of some year. And so depending on whether you normalize them to 2024 or 2010, wages have risen in that time period somewhere between $8,000 and $10,000, though the purchasing power of the dollar has declined. So you have sort of slow wage growth, but you have rising wages, for some folks at the very top, and sort of increasingly stagnant wages for folks at the bottom, with sort of middle growth for those in between. But then you have the purchasing power of the dollar declining during this period of time. So just for reference, in 2010, the Consumer Price Index, which is just a weighted average of how much it costs to buy a bundle of goods, although the goods that are in that bundle change over time. So it's one of the better metrics we have, but it's also hard to compare across time. So in 2010, it's hovering around 45, and in 2024, it has dropped to about 31, and it stays there. And at least last time I checked, we don't have numbers for 2025 yet. And so, they're different situations qualitatively, but they're also different situations socially in a lot of ways, in the quality and standards of life that people have and are expecting to have. So it's challenging to, I think, make a direct one-to-one comparison between millennials at sort of the dawn of the Great Recession and folks coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent recession, partially because we're still kind of in it. I mean, history, I guess, will tell us when it ended, but we're so close to it, at least, if not still in it, that it's hard to say broadly, the ultimate impacts that this will have.
Also, on the media front, as it's always acting as a kind of dark mirror for whatever economic and cultural phenomena we're going through, I would like to say that there are a few examples of American media that better demonstrate the impacts of the Great Recession on American families than The Real Housewives of Orange County, which at one point sort of turned into an unintentional documentary of the fallout of the housing crash. You had Lynn Curtin's children being served an eviction notice on camera. You had Tamra Judge being forced to downsize. You had Gina's real estate business being drastically hit. And then you had Vicky holding up because she is a self-proclaimed financial maven who always lived below her means. And on a similar note, as much as media in America was quite conservative prior to 2008, and especially prior to 2006, you can see so many ways in which the media culture that millennials were sort of raised on was impacted by this Great Recession fallout. In fact, one sort of meta example is the enormous prominence of reality television as compared to prior generations. And why do we have so much of it post-recession? Because it's extremely cheap to make and usually doesn't have to follow union rules. And it wasn't just the Great Recession itself that had an impact on millennials and their psychology. It was the fallout and what happened as a result politically and economically. Because whether you were being evicted from your home or graduating into a tanked industry, what was undeniable is that 2008-ish America faced a very distinct policy choice for their financial and political leaders, and they chose to lean into an economic model that largely forgave the worst offenders while leaving the middle class holding the bag. And in my view, you cannot talk about the millennial relationship to things like wealth and economics and power without talking about Occupy Wall Street. Something that a lot of younger people may not even really remember was a thing, in large part because the powers that be don't want us to. Because this was an era where people were literally taking to the streets to protest wealth inequality in a largely bipartisan way, something that feels almost inconceivable today. In fact, the very framing of the 99 versus the 1% is a level of class consciousness and sort of almost apolitical rejection of wealth inequality and financial/corporate power run amok that we had essentially never seen in America prior. And there can sometimes be a kind of cynical view that Occupy Wall Street didn't actually accomplish anything, and much ink has been spilled to that end. But it's worth noting that it was really the first time in modern American culture where corporatism was viewed with as open and significant a level of skepticism as it was. Because think back to what preceded it in terms of media. The corporate greed-obsessed 80s and 90s where having a white-collar job and upward mobility were so taken for granted in the culture that many of the most iconic movies of that later era were about feeling stifled and bored by having an office job.
Everything's a copy of a copy of a copy.
So much so that sometimes you just start beating on people.
So I was 15 when the Great Recession started, and my mom works in healthcare, so we didn't have that same sense of, we didn't have, the housing crisis and all these things were happening, and I was seeing it in the news, and Katrina, all of these things happening kind of in that same bubble burst. I was inoculated from a bunch of that, but in pop culture, definitely that was the thing that you saw. And I think especially Occupy Wall Street, the thing that I realized retroactively is how spoken down to those young people were. How we were being told in pop culture not to take them seriously. The stigmatizing them of being rich kids who were camping out. The exact same thing they're saying about the protesters at college campuses of oh, these are rich kids who are out of step. We do this thing habitually of telling young people who are actively trying to make a difference or at least highlight these things that oh, they're disconnected. And I think beginning in this era, you also see kind of a rise in not yet anti-intellectualism, but kind of the caring less and less about what your educational background was, of kind of starting to not totally believe expertise and talking and feeling like people who were educated were inherently talking down to you. And while there is elitism and privileges for sure in educational spaces in university, I think that a college kid going in these campuses who's going to be entering the job market would probably know more about the current state of the job market than someone who's been working the same job for 30, 40 years.
And while clearly some of the stated aims of the Occupy Wall Street movement did not actually come to fruition, What's undeniable is that this initial awareness of the, again, total unfairness and misalignment of corporate and average American interests has continued to permeate our political culture, and basically now both parties have to pay lip service to economic populism in order to get elected. In fact, part of the reason we're in our current political situation is because the right has become so effective at weaponizing a kind of false flag economic populism to push through an ultimately very corporatist agenda. See the big beautiful bill. Quote, Occupy Wall Street is part of a series of events that precipitate an understanding of the limitations of corporate America, something that today has morphed into a sense of the misdeeds not only by the financial sector, the fossil fuel sector, and now by big tech. It was the first critique that crystallized it in a very powerful way, and subsequent movements built on growing understanding, a sense that the corporate sector is not really serving American interests. But that said, we can clearly see in the political response to the crash that the approach, again bipartisan, was not to actually help the average American, despite the power of movements like Occupy Wall Street, but to bail out the worst culprits. Where the White House was holding meetings with bank CEOs to tell them to, quote, help me help you, to stop even Democrats' efforts to prevent the bailout from subsidizing massive bonus payouts to American International Group, and signing legislation to rescind presidential authority to allocate cash from a bailout to Americans who lost their homes. And what was the result of a lot of this political response? Well, it's that wealth inequality has actually gotten worse since 2008. So if anything, it's sort of strange that millennials have inherited this reputation as being overly optimistic or having lived in a kind of economic paradise, when the reality was pretty much the opposite, at least financially. Because we had every reason to become extremely disillusioned, and to be fair, many of us did.
Like in the broader lens of human history, it tends to be characterized by sort of real pushes towards scientific and social progress, followed often by backlash. I think it is hasty to say that in such a short period of time, people have really failed to follow through. We might just be in the backlash period. The open and I think quite concerning question is, well, how long will the backlash last, and what will it ultimately cost us? I do think real, substantial, practical changes, deeply imperfect changes, but I don't know what more one might expect, were made, during this period of time. And certainly it's appropriate to think that, we were too optimistic or look back and try to learn from mistakes that were made. But I think we'd be remiss to say no good, no progress, nothing came out of this era.
Because on top of the economic and political reality we were coming of age into, we were also facing a headwind of a lot of generational stereotypes, some more fair than others. Which brings us to Chapter 3, Generation Me and Girlboss Confidence. Imposter syndrome might be something that we now associate with millennials and Gen Z, but it might arguably be in response to the hyper-confidence that was at one point associated with millennial children. The stereotypes about millennials were often rooted in their relative childishness and self-obsession.
What do you say to the idea that millennials are narcissists and self-absorbed?
It's definitely not true.
Selfish, naive, too young, all ways to supposedly describe middle-aged millennials.
Now, for some reason, the boomers are upset and mad at the millennials. And to be fair, everybody's mad at the millennials.
When I was trying to buy my first home, I wasn't buying. Smashed avocados for $19 and 4 coffees at $4 each.
So you reckon that's real?
If you saw my last special, I made fun of millennials. When I was growing up, our parents let us play in the street, climb trees, and blow stuff up.
An infantilized ego, coupled with a lack of self-dependency, that no overuse of emojis or hilarious cat memes in the work group chat would ever be able to cure.
When millennials were the new kids in the office, there was undeniably a media narrative that we thought we were too good, that we deserved promotions without working for them, that we wanted the participation trophies that we got in our youth, which maybe I'm the only one, but I never got participation trophies. I don't know where that was a thing. You did? Okay. Okay, my producer is saying that she got participation trophies, but that no one wanted them. And part of this stereotyping of millennials as being these overconfident, narcissistic, undeserving so-and-sos was obviously part of the inevitable intergenerational hazing that basically always happens to the new kids on the block. But what's interesting about the millennial generation, and likely a big part of the reason why it's now retroactively viewed as such a confident, optimistic time, is because of another phenomenon that took us by storm coming out of school. The girlboss/hustle era, and how so much of our confidence in that time was tied up in achieving professionally/academically. It's also worth noting that in the pre-COVID era especially, there was a much bigger focus on things like in-person socializing and networking, but we'll get to that a little later. Because if millennials had a reputation for being undeservedly confident, especially in things like the workplace, it's likely, at least in part, because as a generation, financially, academically, professionally, we had to fake it until we make it. Because we were entering an extremely difficult job market, many industries totally decimated, many degrees now basically worthless. And yet there was still the sort of omnipresent view that in our culture, your success is basically entirely defined by your financial and professional status. So what was the response as a collective? Hustle. We might forget now, but the entire sort of girl boss phenomenon wasn't just an aesthetic. For many women, it was a necessity.
The still building my empire. That is such an interesting time because at first I just took it on the chin as like a joke, but then I realized, oh, they're being very serious. I always really link up the live action 101 Dalmatians with Glenn Close, like The Devil Wears Prada, and like the way that the girl boss was starting out as like kind of like a cold, older woman who could not maintain house and home, right? And then the pop culture girl boss then evolved into someone who could have it all and was juggling all of these things together, but then was doing fraud, but doing it in a cute way. And I think it's interesting how much the purpose of feminism had been warped and misused in order to kind of say like it's okay if women are also bad bosses because they're doing it for praxis. And again, it was mostly white women, and it was still women who were very heteroconforming, who were thin, who had to play into all these performances of gender. Even if you look at like, you know, Elizabeth Holmes with Theranos, of how being able to like use androgynous but still white femme appearance to sell herself to these very ridiculous men who like did no research, but like all the women were like, I think something is suspicious here. We were also seeing this era of women really talking about and really explaining how they, like the medical issues that have to do when you're a woman. Like part of why we have all these MLMs and all of these health scammers in part is because the medical industry is very misogynistic. And so it creates these, and because we know that and we have all of this knowledge about the things that they miss out and all these health and gut issues that like they don't check with women, it creates this market for these women who also don't know anything, but can sell it to you in this kind of like soothing, you know, divine feminine woo-woo kind of way. You know, the girl boss is now like a girl boss witch, you know, like it's someone who's gonna be like, yeah, if you just have this powder and sip and you're a girl's girl, like it's girl's girl to not think and just drink your little potion and get skinny, and then you're gonna just have everything manifest to you. Like it's so funny how when capitalism can like make anything monetizable. And so I think the girl boss has kind of evolved into like the softer trad wife who's still selling you something, but selling it to you in a softer, kinder way. Like, get out of the office, girl. Get out of the office, girl. Go back to your natural space of the home and the hearth. You know, let your man pay for things, you know. Even that's coming back is like the really strict of like, no, men are supposed to pay for things. Like especially on TikTok, there's a real pushing of like dating gender norms. It's very a recession indicator of like, we actually cannot afford to girl boss anymore. We need these men to pay the bills.
And we can even see now in Gen Z that a lot of the girl boss mentality has sort of been reshaped into a kind of big sister role. Quote, millennials entered the workforce during the 2008 financial crisis, so they were grateful to get any type of work. It's not surprising that millennials then glorified hustle culture and invented the girl boss. On the other hand, Gen Zers entered the workforce around the pandemic and the Great Resignation, where many people began to feel like there's more to life than just work. In the same way, it's not surprising that Gen Z gave birth to the internet big sister, less concerned about work, more focused on the way you live your life and how to find a partner. And this overconfident sort of girl-bossified approach was even reflected in how we used social media. As I mentioned in the intro, in the millennial era, there was still this view that the internet and technology generally were more a tool for good than evil, and were extremely valuable not just for your personal life, but for your professional career. There was such a blurring of our professional and personal selves as it came to our online presence or even our IRL socialization that we've largely now moved away from, because maybe this feels like a relic of a different time, but there was a huge discourse when millennials were younger about not even having photos of yourself on Facebook holding a beer because an employer might one day see it.
As someone who was broke in their 20s, proudly so, $20 could take you a lot farther than it could right now. I used to be able to feed myself for about a week on really shitty food, mind you. It was Checkers, but I did eat for a week. And I think you were able to hustle and finesse a little bit more and have fun and enjoy it, especially because we weren't as on social media. So there wasn't a need to monetize every experience. You could go to the club. You could go and have drinks. Like I remember going to like Nowhere in like by the village and getting like $2 cups of wine in a plastic cup served to me by a hot twink. And I'm just like, this is society. I do think that if anything really did shift, I think if there really is like a generational delineation between millennials and Gen Z, it is COVID. I think COVID changed so many of the things that allowed millennials to enjoy their youth. It did rob us of our, like, for many of us, like the beginning of our 30s and the end of our 20s, but we got to have like A20s with like a really fun club culture. I think we had the last of like the real hustler transplants. And I think now with Gen Z, like that was a long time. Like I think about it now, it's been 5 years since like COVID really started. And I still like, I still cannot really think to enjoy going to a club, you know, because I'm like, if one person calls, I got to get out of there. And I think that's a real thing. Like it's really expensive to go out now. People's dining experiences have totally shifted. Things just cost a lot more money than they did when we were growing up, just with inflation and the value of $1.
But when you look at the stereotypes around millennials, that we were overconfident and narcissistic, it's sort of ironic given that the other prevailing stereotype about millennials is essentially its exact opposite, that we didn't know how to adult. Which brings us to chapter 4, were millennials that bad at adulting? So we simply can't talk about the enduring legacy of millennials, especially as it pertains to media and online culture, without talking about adulting. Now, this is maybe a sidebar, but my very first book, I'm Only Here for the Wi-Fi, A Complete Guide to Reluctant Adulthood, very much came to prominence, or came into existence at least, riding the wave of many such adulting-related books. And in fact, this is a real throwback that some of you may not even remember that this was a real era, but my first book came out in 2012, and it was during the era where the highest achievement for a book was to be featured in Urban Outfitters, which my book was, prominently by the cash registers alongside such other titles as, I guess, adulting. So I would say I was a bit of a vanguard, or at least a strong participant in the adulting trend, which I think is fair to say came slightly before the Girlboss trend. Because I think if we look at the Girlboss trend as a way of kind of crystallizing the reaction and sort of the necessary steps that we needed to take coming into the job market post-recession, its predecessor, which again also became a sort of equal generational stereotype, was the rejection of adulthood as a concept. Because for a lot of us, it felt really overwhelming. But in case you didn't know, adulting was the meme-ified, tongue-in-cheek way millennials started to communicate their distress about having to do anything from putting away dirty dishes to getting their taxes done to going to the post office, things that our parents and older generations did as an accepted part of life. Dozens, if not more, popular books, including my own, were written on the topic, ranging from lamenting about the realities of adulthood to acting as how-to guides. I also would like to say, similar to having had an adulting-related book on shelves in 2012, I was also a bit of a pioneer in the backlash to that with The Financial Diet. And from a 2017 Elle article on the origins of adulting, quote, "The word is now so ubiquitous, it's hard to tell exactly where its quasi-ironic, quasi-earnest usage began, but the most logical point of origin is with a playful hashtag popularized by Kelly Williams Brown's adultingblog.com. In 2013, Brown offered tips on cleaning your house, making a grocery list, saving money, and other hallmarks of the genre. Yet while adulting was being talked about among millennials themselves, the stereotype of the lazy millennial was largely foisted upon them by media. And this is something that we have debunked plenty over the years on this channel. It's easy to put the shortcomings of bigger systemic failures on our backs than to look at the bigger reasons why a lot of these trends are happening. Millennials happen to come of age at a time where a lot of other bad things were happening. Things like the Great Recession, the student debt bubble, slashed employment benefits, etc. Things that made for a much harsher and scarier world, and which can make our generation's decisions on the surface look like they're motivated by laziness or narcissism, when they're usually just motivated by limited choices. And it's also worth noting that a lot of this lazy, doesn't want to work, isn't motivated rhetoric is also starting to affect Gen Z. There have been many similar trend pieces on the topic about Gen Z, just as there were with millennials. And interestingly, Gen Zers have actually been buying homes earlier than their millennial counterparts, which is probably at least in part due to not coming out of the Great Recession. Quote, "In 2023, the homeownership rate for adult Gen Zers, or those between 19 and 26 years old, was higher than homeownership rates for millennials and Gen X when they were 24, according to Redfin. And in addition to not coming out of the Great Recession, this is likely due to a combination of other factors, such as record low interest rates we saw during the early COVID years, or the fact that 1/3 of homes purchased in the US now are at least partially funded by families, something that we explored in our recent video on generational wealth. But Gen Z is also learning to budget earlier and getting their first credit cards earlier than previous generations. I would like to think that them budgeting earlier is entirely thanks to me. However, as we explored in our video about Gen Z being the buy everything, own nothing generation, Gen Z is still lagging behind when it comes to things like long-term wealth building and financial security. A notable 53% have not yet contributed to a 401k or retirement plan, and 49% have yet to purchase life insurance. By comparison, millennials typically bought life insurance by age 28, while Gen Z and baby boomers waited until their early 30s. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, we have things like wealth inequality increasing, while things like home prices and college tuition continue to rise. So when combined with our current, what seems to be looming recession, or at least not thriving economic era, it very much remains to be seen what the rest of Gen Z will actually experience when they come into their adult years.
We were not living in some utopia where everyone was getting paid. I think that there were definitely people who were making money, people who were in STEM, people who were in tech, people who chose those career paths. But I think most people our age who did journalism, the creative writing, we're still struggling because those jobs are very hard. A lot of them do not exist. People who came here to do that, a lot of them have gone home. It has really been a real shift in figuring out what your purpose is. And now Gen Z is going through that now. Now that they're getting older, they realize that like we weren't full of shit. Like it really does suck out here. And because of that arrested development that we have generationally, like a lot of us are kind of behind. You know, I'm 33. By the time my mother was her age, she had 2 children. Me? No. To me, it still would feel like a teen pregnancy. I would be like, I'm not ready. And that's not because I've been lazy. I've been a staff writer as an entertainment journalist. I've worked for a long time. I've worked for different companies, but like all of those freelance jobs, all of those jobs do not pay what they did years ago, and the rents are too expensive. Like 20 years ago, what I was making at that staff job, it would have been great and I could have had that lifestyle, but it's not what it is now. And I think especially with, again, AI and how we devalue journalism in every way, and how influencer culture, for better or for worse, has allowed no real barrier to entry in being able to be in those spaces. We're going through a real reshuffling of creative professionalism. I think that there's good and bad to that. I always think that there's always something good about having new art forms evolve and not trying to keep people out. I do think that there is a lack of respecting that there is a skill to it, but we will see. So I think millennials and our avocado toast, which is good, you know, we were not lazy. We were just living, we just had a little bit of freedom to like enjoy the vibe. And our Gen Z babies are unfortunately not able to feel the vibe because they got COVID.
But if millennials were getting dragged for being simultaneously overconfident and not knowing how to adult, Gen Z is actually starting to see even more workplace-based criticisms than their millennial counterparts. Quote, Resume Genius asked 625 US hiring managers which generation is the most challenging to work with, and 45% pointed to Gen Z, the generation born between 1997 and 2012. What's more, 50% of Gen Z hiring managers admitted that their own generation is the most difficult to manage. Not you guys making a firing squad against yourselves, what's this? But suffice to say, millennials did generally have an energy of, let's just say, reasonable optimism in the face of the economic situation they were coming into, whereas we can clearly see both with self-reported mental health indicators and performance on social media, that a more detached, cynical, and less sincere position generally tends to be the more Gen Z stance.
I mean, we stereotype every generation. I like millennials got accused of crashing the diamond industry, and Gen Z is getting criticized for not wanting to work. Like, I'm sure they'll say nasty things about Gen Alpha too. No one is safe from this. Although I don't think the creation of the word adulting did anybody any favors. And I cringe to think of I think I was given a t-shirt when I was like 14 that had something with adulting on it. I cringe to think like all the places I probably wore that. With respect to the workplace, I think it's very difficult to separate preferences, beliefs, and attitudes as operating as separate but related constructs. Especially in surveys, and especially in surveys that aren't really designed to do that, which is why I try to be cautious when interpreting survey data. And then there are also differences between, for instance, like expressed versus revealed preferences. Like if I ask you what you prefer and you tell me some answer, but then I give you a set of choices, right? Does your choice reflect that preference you told me? Or we might call those actual decision-making tasks your revealed preferences. And there's pros and cons to both ways of like trying to get preferences. But with I guess those caveats, when we look at differences between Gen Z and millennials when asked specifically questions about the workplace, there aren't a ton of people asking like large samples of Gen Z and millennials this, but there are a few. We see that they have different preferences both for the work they do and the kinds of workplaces that they operate in. So millennials tend to emphasize the importance of fulfilling work, like work that is going to align with their morals, fulfill some social good. They're going to leave at the end of the day and feel good about themselves, feel like they had an impact on the world that was positive. Whereas Gen Z is emphasizing the importance of work-life balance, sort of their ability to do things and have meaningful identities and lives outside of the workplace, and placing less of an emphasis relatively on sort of the importance of fulfilling work. You know, but when we think about, I guess, or when I think about attitudes towards work or the workplace, it's hard to think about how to benchmark these things, right? Like it seems like Gen Z has preferences for a different set of norms in the workplace, whereas millennials are expressing more preferences for the kind of work that they do. And I think it's very easy to say, well, it's good that we have a shared set of professional norms, and that Gen Z trying to change these norms or refusing to comply with these norms is necessarily a bad thing. You know, one might like think, well, what if some of these norms are bad, or they're not conducive to efficient work, right? Isn't it maybe worth the short-term cost to change them for better long-term gain? Like what if the norm is we regularly work overtime uncompensated, right? That seems to be one in particular that people in Gen Z entering the workforce are concerned with and really care about their ability to have this work-life balance and sort of a strict end to their workday, right? We might think that that's a productive norm to think about changing, but it's going to come with a short-term cost, and that cost appears to be, at least in part, a reputation of people saying, well, Gen Z just doesn't want to work Gen Z and millennials definitely have different priorities on the whole when they think about work and like have attitudes towards work. You know, Gen Z seems partially like they want to change the system or exist partially in, partially outside of it, whereas millennials seem like they've really mastered working within and like alongside these existing systems and norms, despite coming out of really tumultuous economic circumstances.
Which brings us to the final question. Was it really paradise? When you look into the stats on millennial upward mobility after years of being behind in terms of homeownership and wealth building, on the surface it seems like we are finally catching up or even surpassing our parents' generation, at least financially. Some reports even say that millennials are set to become the richest generation in history. But if you dig a little bit deeper into the data, you'll see that this is not exactly a realistic picture. Because yes, there's more wealth, but that does not mean it's being spread evenly among individuals. There is actually more wealth specifically because there is greater wealth inequality. Quote, there are some millennials who are doing extremely well. Think Mark Zuckerberg with a net worth of $164.5 billion, while others remain mired in debt. This graph divides each generation in 10 equal-sized groups ranked by their average wealth. In each generation, the bottom 10% have negative net worth. Their debts are larger than their assets. In each generation, most of the wealth is held by the wealthiest households, especially those in the top 10% of the distribution. Those in the middle of the distribution have rather modest levels of wealth. Median household wealth, referring to the middle point in the distribution, was $58K among baby boomers, $73K among Gen Xers, and $100K among millennials. In sum, although average millennial household wealth now exceeds the average wealth of previous generations, wealth has become even more unequally distributed within generations. Addressing extreme wealth inequality requires urgent policy intervention. One of the reasons we focus so much on wealth inequality on this channel, and specifically in our video essays, is because the absence of analyzing along the lines of wealth inequality allows people to paint really inaccurate pictures. So for example, you may have been seeing a lot of headlines about how millennials are doing so well. But when you actually drill down in the data, you can see that that is totally dependent on essentially the kind of financial situation they were already coming from, and in many cases, their race. Because when you break down the numbers amongst millennials, the growing wealth is really concentrated among one group, and that is white people. Quote, in 1983, the average wealth of white families was about $320,000 higher than the average wealth of black families and Hispanic families. By 2022, white families' average wealth, $1.4 million, was more than $1 million higher than that of black families, $211,596, and Hispanic families, $227,554. Put another way, white families had 6 times the average wealth of black families and Hispanic families. This gap is also hugely apparent in things like homeownership, where the black-white homeownership gap has now reached a record 30.5 percentage points, which is the highest level in 50 years. And the maddening thing is that the easiest way to resolve these issues of wealth inequality are also extremely popular from a policy perspective, and that is, survey says, taxing the rich. Quote, more than 6 in 10 US adults say tax rates on large businesses and corporations should be raised, and about 6 in 10 say tax rates on household income over $400,000 should be raised as well, including 23% who say these tax rates should be raised by a lot. If I had to sum up what I think a lot of the vibes-based difference between the millennial and Gen Z approach to things like optimism and hope in the future, I think there are a few things that we have to take in mind. Part of it is our media landscape, which again is sort of in a feedback loop with the era we're currently living in, but undeniably has a huge impact on how we perceive the world around us. But I think that coming out of 2008, there was a definite feeling that we were, as a society, tilting toward a more progressive arc, that we were living history, and that while imperfect, we were starting to trend toward progress. Lest we forget, the electoral map in 2008 looked so radically different than we'd basically ever seen it before, with huge numbers of working and middle-class Americans coming over to a proposed more progressive agenda. So even if we as millennials were on an individual level economically really struggling and coming into a tough job market and being hit with all of these cultural stereotypes about how we don't work hard, or we think that we deserve too much, or we're too confident, or we hate ourselves, or all of these other things, there was at least this sort of hope that things were generally getting better as a society.
It's not necessarily a bad thing to be nostalgic for a period of time where there was a greater sense of social trust, greater interpersonal trust, greater institutional trust, conditional on that nostalgia translating into behavior that's, I think, conducive to getting back to a better place, right? Just missing, this period of time isn't really going to do anything. But I think if we can identify, well, what about it do we miss? And part of what we might miss is, a greater sense of shared identity or shared norms, or just greater social cohesion, and thinking about like what's driving this widespread nostalgia, and then actually acting to try to get back to those things that people clearly miss and want.
I think what a lot of Gen Z has experienced, especially coming of age defined by the pandemic, is that when we need it most, often there is no one coming to help. Things aren't necessarily getting better. We aren't necessarily learning our lessons. And even though on certain economic factors or employment rates or homeownership, Gen Z might be doing slightly better than we are as millennials, I think they have a fundamentally much more cynical view of what's possible. And maybe part of that was even shaped by seeing how millennials were able to move or not move through their young adulthood, depending on what situation they happened to be born into. Ultimately, though, one thing that is undeniably true for each generation, and only getting more so in America, is that the context you exist in and what you can expect out of your future is largely dependent on how you started this life. We joke about Nepo babies, but the truth is, you're essentially having to be a Nepo baby now just to one day own a home. At the end of the day, though, as a millennial who was formerly the victim of many an avocado toast related barb, because trust me, if you were a credit card debt holding millennial, you were the most hated group of all. They would never stop making fun of you. One thing that does not help us is intergenerational fighting. Ultimately, we are all in this together, and if we could take one thing from Occupy Wall Street, it is that it is truly the 99% versus the 1%, and a lot of the rest of this stuff is just a distraction. I'll see you guys next month.